In the quiet corridors of memory, where whispers of the past drift like autumn leaves through time, there lies a story of shadows and light, of a young wizard's first terrible step into darkness, and how that darkness was eventually overcome by courage and love. Dear listener, as you settle into the comfort of this moment, let your breathing slow and your mind drift gently into the magical world where even the deepest shadows can find their way back to light. The year was 1943, and Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry stood as it always had, ancient, magnificent, and filled with the endless possibilities that young magic brings. The castle's stone walls held secrets in their very mortar, and moving staircases carried students between floors like gentle giants shepherding their charges. In the great hall, floating candles cast dancing shadows on the enchanted ceiling, where stars twinkled in eternal twilight, and the 4 house tables gleamed with a warm glow of belonging. Among the students who walked these hallowed halls was one whose name would echo through history, though none could yet imagine the path his footsteps would carve. Tom Riddle moved through Hogwarts like silk through water, graceful, compelling, and utterly magnetic. He was, by all appearances, the perfect student. His robes were always pristine, his dark hair perfectly arranged, and his handsome features carried an aristocratic bearing that seemed to command respect without effort. Teachers smiled when he raised his hand in class. Fellow students gathered around him in common rooms, and prefects nodded approvingly as he passed through corridors with quiet dignity. But beneath this carefully crafted exterior, something darker stirred. Tom had learned early in life that charm could open doors that force could not, that a gentle smile could hide the most dangerous intentions, and that power, true power, lay not in what others could see, but in what they never suspected. The boy who had grown up in the grey walls of Wool's orphanage had discovered magic not as a gift, but as a tool, and he wielded it with the precision of an artist and the hunger of someone who had never known unconditional love. In his 5th year at Hogwarts, as autumn painted the grounds in shades of gold and crimson, Tom made a discovery that would change everything. Deep in the restricted section of the library, where dust motes danced in shafts of filtered moonlight, and ancient books whispered secrets to those brave enough to listen, he found a tome that spoke of magic so dark, so forbidden, that even its pages seemed to shudder at their own contents. The book spoke of Horcruxes, objects that could house fragments of a wizard's soul, ensuring that death could never truly claim them. For most young wizards, such knowledge would have brought revulsion, a natural recoiling from something that violated the very essence of what magic should be. But Tom felt only fascination, a cold excitement that ran through his veins like winter streams. Here was power beyond imagination, immortality within grasp, and all it required was the willingness to split one's soul through the most terrible act imaginable: murder. The castle around him seemed to sense the shift in his intentions, though no portrait spoke of it, no ghosts warned of what was coming. The very stones of Hogwarts, which had witnessed centuries of young magic learning to find its way, now harbored something that moved against the natural order. In the depths below the school, in chambers that most students never knew existed, something ancient and terrible began to stir, responding to the call of its air. Tom had always known he was different, special, destined for greatness. The discovery of his heritage as the descendant of Salazar Slytherin had only confirmed what he had always felt in his bones. Now, with the knowledge of Horcruxes burning in his mind like a fever, he began to plan. He would need a victim, someone whose death would not be traced back to him, and he would need an object worthy of containing a piece of his immortal soul. The victim came to him as if fate itself was conspiring to aid his dark purpose. Myrtle Warren, a Ravenclaw student known more for her tears than her academic achievements, had always been an easy target for cruel jokes and casual cruelty. She haunted the girls' bathroom on the second floor like a living ghost even before her death, weeping over slights both real and imagined, her thick glasses perpetually fogged with tears, her lank hair hanging around her face like curtains of sorrow. Tom observed her patterns with the patience of a predator studying prey. He learned her habits, her favorite hiding places, the times when she would be most vulnerable and alone. All the while, he maintained his perfect facade. The charming prefect, the brilliant student, the young wizard everyone believed destined for greatness in the most noble sense. The object he chose for his first Horcrux was equally calculated. His diary, a simple leather-bound journal that had been his companion since his early years at Hogwarts. Into its pages he had poured his thoughts, his plans, his growing understanding of magic and power. It was, in many ways, already a part of him, making it the perfect vessel for what he intended to do. On a night when November rain tapped against the castle windows like skeletal fingers, and the wind howled through corridors carrying whispers of winter's approach, Tom enacted his plan. The Chamber of Secrets, opened through his command of Parseltongue, released its ancient guardian, a basilisk of immense size and deadly power, a creature that had slumbered in the depths of the castle for centuries, waiting for the call of Slytherin's heir. Poor Myrtle never had a chance to understand what was happening. She had fled to her usual refuge, the girls' bathroom where she could weep in solitude, when the great serpent found her. In the brief moment between seeing those deadly yellow eyes and feeling life drain from her body, she experienced not fear, but a strange sort of relief, as if some part of her had been waiting for this ending all along. The act was done quickly, almost gently, as death magic sometimes can be. Tom felt the tearing in his soul, a sensation like cold lightning running through his very essence, as the murder split his being in two. One part remained within his body, while the other, raw and bleeding with dark energy, was pressed into the waiting pages of his diary through rituals too terrible to speak aloud. The diary absorbed this fragment with an hunger that seemed almost alive. The leather cover grew darker, more lustrous, and the pages within began to shimmer with a presence that was both Tom Riddle and something other. It was his first Horcrux, his first step toward the immortality he craved, and his first true descent into the darkness that would eventually consume the boy he had been. But even as Tom celebrated this dark victory in the privacy of his heart, consequences began to ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. The Chamber of Secrets had been opened, a student had died, and Hogwarts itself seemed to shiver with the knowledge that something fundamental had been violated within its walls. The school that had stood as a beacon of magical learning for over 1,000 years now harbored a secret that would fester like a wound for decades to come. Tom, however, was careful. When the authorities came asking questions, when teachers demanded answers, when students whispered in fearful huddles about what could have killed poor Myrtle, he was ready with misdirection. He had cultivated a friendship with Hagrid, the gentle half-giant who kept dangerous creatures as pets, and when suspicion needed a target, Tom provided one with ruthless efficiency. The diary, meanwhile, was kept close, treasured, and protected. Tom would write in its pages and watch with fascination as the ink disappeared, absorbed by the hungry fragment of soul within. Sometimes, late at night, when the castle slept around him, he would place his hand on the cover and feel the pulse of the dark magic within, his first step toward becoming something more than human, though, in truth, it was his first step toward becoming something far less. Years passed, and Tom graduated from Hogwarts with highest honors, his perfect record unmarred by any suspicion of his true nature. The diary went with him, carefully hidden among his possessions, a secret treasure that contained not just a piece of his soul, but the memory of his first murder, his first taste of power over life and death. But the diary story was far from over. As Tom Riddle grew into the Dark Lord Voldemort, as he gathered followers and spread fear across the wizarding world, the diary remained safely hidden, waiting. It would spend decades in darkness, patient as only objects touched by dark magic can be patient, until the day when it would once again taste the light of the world above. That day came 50 years after Myrtle's death, and the diary found its way into the innocent hands of an 11-year-old girl named Ginny Weasley. Lucius Malfoy, one of Voldemort's most devoted followers, had slipped the seemingly harmless book among her school supplies, never imagining the chaos it would unleash. For the diary was no ordinary Horcrux. It possessed not just a fragment of Voldemort's soul, but his memories, his personality, his ability to manipulate and control. Ginny, youngest of the Weasley children, and the only daughter in a family of boys, was eager to fit in at Hogwarts, desperate to prove herself worthy of the magical world she had dreamed of joining. When she found the mysterious diary that wrote back to her, that listened to her fears and loneliness with seeming understanding, she thought she had found a friend. The diary, speaking through the 16-year-old Tom Riddle's charming persona, became her confidant. It listened to her worries about living up to her brother's achievements, her fears about not being sorted into Gryffindor, her embarrassment over her family's modest means. And with each confidence shared, each fear confessed, each innocent word written in its pages, the diary grew stronger, while Ginny grew weaker. The possession was gradual, gentle as a spider's web settling over its prey. The diary fed on Ginny's energy, her life force, her very soul, while giving back memories and emotions that felt real but belonged to someone else entirely. She began to have blackouts, periods where she would find herself in places with no memory of how she had arrived there. Strange things began happening around the castle. Messages written in blood, students found petrified, an atmosphere of fear that grew thicker with each passing day. Through Ginny's unwilling hands, the diary once again opened the Chamber of Secrets. The great basilisk stirred from its half-century slumber, responding to the call of its master's memory, preserved within the journal's pages. But this time, its victims survived, turned to stone rather than killed outright, saved by chance glimpses through mirrors, cameras, and ghosts. As the school year progressed and panic spread through Hogwarts like wildfire, Ginny grew weaker and more desperate. She tried to flush the diary down the toilet, to rid herself of the influence she could feel growing stronger each day. But Tom Riddle's hold on her was too strong. He called the book back to her, whispered promises and threats in equal measure, and slowly drained away her strength to feed his own growing manifestation. Meanwhile, Harry Potter, the boy who had lived, the child who had faced Voldemort as a baby and survived, began to investigate the strange happenings plaguing his second year at Hogwarts. Guided by loyalty to his friends and an courage that burned bright even in the darkest moments, Harry followed a trail of clues that led inexorably toward the truth. The final confrontation came in the Chamber of Secrets itself, deep beneath the castle where Salazar Slytherin's legacy waited in stone and scale. Ginny lay dying on the cold chamber floor, her life force nearly entirely drained to fuel Tom Riddle's return to physical form. The diary sat nearby, its pages now glowing with malevolent energy as the teenage memory of the Dark Lord grew more solid, more real, more dangerous with each passing moment. Harry faced this memory of evil with nothing but his wand, his courage, and his faith in the power of love and friendship. When Dumbledore's phoenix, Fawkes, arrived carrying the sorting hat, it seemed impossible that such simple magic could stand against the darkness that had been growing for 50 years. But as Harry drew the sword of Godric Gryffindor from the hat's depths, as Fawkes's healing tears closed the wounds inflicted by the basilisk's deadly fangs, the true power of love and loyalty revealed itself. With the great snake defeated and its venom coating the sword's blade, Harry turned to face the diary, the first Horcrux, the beginning of Voldemort's journey into darkness, the split soul that had claimed one life and nearly claimed another. The sword, blessed with basilisk venom, pierced the diary's heart with a sound like screaming wind. The reaction was immediate and violent. Tom Riddle's forming body writhed and twisted, his perfect features contorting with rage and disbelief. Light poured from the diary's wounded pages, not the warm golden light of healing magic, but the harsh, blinding illumination of a soul fragment being forcibly torn from its anchor. The piece of Voldemort's essence, trapped within the journal for 50 years, was finally freed, finally destroyed, finally sent to whatever realm awaits souls that have been split from their wholeness. As the light faded and the screaming stopped, Ginny stirred on the chamber floor, her strength returning as the diary's malevolent influence was broken forever. The first Horcrux was destroyed. The first piece of Voldemort's fractured soul was gone, and though neither Harry nor Ginny could know it at the time, the first step had been taken on the long road that would eventually lead to the Dark Lord's final defeat. In the gentle quiet that followed, as Harry helped Ginny to her feet and Fawkes sang his healing song, the ancient chamber seemed to sigh with relief. The darkness that had lingered there for 50 years was finally cleansed. The evil that had claimed one life and nearly claimed another was banished, and the first shadow cast by Tom Riddle's young ambition had finally found its way back to the light. Dear listener, as this first chapter of our gentle journey draws to its close, let yourself rest in the knowledge that even the darkest magic can be overcome by courage, loyalty, and love. The diary that once held such terrible power now lies destroyed, its malevolent presence no more than a memory, and the souls it threatened have found their way back to safety and peace. let your breathing slow. Let your mind drift toward rest, and know that in the morning, like Harry and Ginny emerging from the depths of the chamber, you too will rise renewed, whole, and surrounded by the light that always finds a way to overcome the darkness that seeks to divide us from ourselves and from those we love. Sleep now, and let the first shadow fade into dreams of brighter days ahead. As the moon rises gently over the English countryside, casting silver light through ancient oak trees and across fields where wildflowers sleep beneath dewdrops like scattered diamonds, we turn our attention to another fragment of darkness seeking its way back to wholeness. Dear listener, let your mind drift like mist over moor and meadow as we explore the story of a ring that carried centuries of sorrow, pride, and ultimately redemption through sacrifice. In the rolling hills beyond the village of Little Hangleton, where ivy-covered cottages dozed peacefully beneath thatched roofs, and the river otter meandered through meadows painted with buttercups and clover, there stood a house that time seemed to have forgotten. The gaunt shack, if it could still be called a house, leaned against the hillside like an old man resting against a garden gate, its walls weathered grey as storm clouds, and its windows dim with the dust of decades. This humble dwelling was all that remained of what had once been one of the most ancient and noble wizarding bloodlines in Britain. The Gaunts traced their heritage back through centuries of pure wizarding blood to Salazar Slytherin himself, one of the 4 founders of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. They were the last of Slytherin's line, the final guardians of his legacy, though that guardianship had long since twisted into something bitter and broken. In the summer of 1943, when the air hung heavy with the scent of honeysuckle and the promise of thunderstorms, and when young Tom Riddle was discovering the terrible secrets of Horcrux magic in the depths of Hogwarts Library, the Gaunt family consisted of only 3 members. There was Marvolo Gaunt, the family patriarch, whose face bore the aristocratic features of his ancient lineage, but whose eyes held the wild gleam of generations of inbreeding and obsession with blood purity. His son, Morfin, inherited not only his father's violent temperament, but also his ability to speak Parseltongue, the rare gift of conversing with serpents that marked them as true heirs of Slytherin. And then there was Merope, Morfin's sister and Marvolo's only daughter, who moved through the decrepit shack like a shadow cast by candlelight. She was plain where her male relatives were harsh, gentle where they were violent, and possessed of a magical ability so suppressed by years of abuse and neglect that it barely flickered within her like a candle struggling against winter wind. Among the few treasures that remained to the Gaunt family, jealously guarded and obsessively protected, was a ring of extraordinary significance. It was no ordinary piece of jewelry, this ring that Marvolo wore with such fierce pride upon his dirty, gnarled finger, set into a heavy gold band that had tarnished with age and neglect, was a black stone, smooth as a midnight pool, and inscribed with a symbol that few wizards would recognize, the mark of the Deathly Hallows, the legendary objects that could make one master of death itself. The ring had been passed down through generations of Gaunts, each patriarch adding to its legend and its power. They knew it as Slytherin's ring, a family heirloom that proved their noble heritage beyond any doubt or contradiction. What they did not know, what even Marvolo's obsessive research into his family's history had never revealed was that the black stone was something far more precious and dangerous than any mere family treasure. It was the resurrection stone, one of the 3 deathly hallows, capable of summoning the shades of the dead back to the world of the living. The stone had found its way into Slytherin's possession centuries ago, and from there into the Gaunt family line, where it had rested in ignorance of its true nature. Generation after generation of Gaunts had worn it, polished it, treasured it, never knowing that they carried one of the most powerful magical artifacts ever created. The ring became a symbol of their pride, their heritage, their unshakable belief in their own superiority over the magical and non-magical world alike. But pride, as the old stories tell us, often comes before the fall, and the Gaunt family's obsession with their pure blood status had led them down a path of isolation, violence, and gradual degradation. They had grown suspicious of all outsiders, paranoid about their bloodline's purity, and increasingly unstable with each passing generation. The ring, which should have been a symbol of their noble legacy, became instead a badge of their growing madness. In the summer evenings, when twilight painted the countryside in shades of lavender and gold, young Tom Riddle would sometimes walk the lanes around Little Hangleton, his handsome features composed in thoughtful contemplation as he considered the research he had been conducting into his own heritage. He had learned of his connection to the Gaunt family through careful investigation at Hogwarts, piecing together genealogical records and family trees with the patience of a scholar and the determination of someone seeking not just knowledge, but power. The visit, when it finally came, was like the meeting of 2 different worlds, one representing the ancient, decaying past, and the other, the brilliant, terrible future. Tom appeared at the Gaunt shack on a warm afternoon, when the air shimmered with heat and the wildflowers drooped their heads in the drowsy sunshine. He was immaculately dressed, composed, and utterly charming, presenting himself as a young wizard interested in his family's history and eager to learn about his heritage. Marvolo Gaunt, flattered by the attention and impressed by Tom's obvious education and breeding, welcomed his unknown nephew with a pride that had been starved of acknowledgement for decades. Here, finally, was a member of the family line who looked like he belonged in the company of nobles, who spoke with the accent of the educated, who seemed worthy of the Gaunt name and legacy. Tom listened with apparent fascination as Marvolo regaled him with stories of the family's ancient glory, their connection to Salazar Slytherin, their superiority over the common magical rabble. And all the while, his dark eyes remained fixed on the ring that Marvolo wore with such obvious pride, the black stone catching the afternoon light like a fragment of captured night. The old man, eager to impress his distinguished visitor, spoke at length about the ring's significance, its proof of their pure blood heritage, its connection to Slytherin himself. Tom nodded and smiled and asked all the right questions, playing the role of the fascinated descendant, seeking to understand his noble birthright. But behind his charming facade, his mind was working with cold precision, calculating opportunity and planning the acquisition of what he recognized immediately as a suitable vessel for his second Horcrux. When Tom finally departed that afternoon, walking back down the dusty lane toward Little Hangleton with his hands clasped behind his back and his expression thoughtful, Marvolo Gaunt watched him go with satisfaction. He had impressed the boy, he was certain, had shown him the true glory of their bloodline and the ancient power they wielded. The old man settled back into his chair with a grunt of contentment, his gnarled fingers absently turning the ring around his finger, never suspecting that he had just signed his own death warrant. The murder, when it came, was swift and efficient. Tom returned to the shack under cover of darkness, moving through the countryside like a shadow given form, his wand ready, and his intentions as cold as winter stars. He found Marvolo alone. Morfin was away on one of his violent rampages, and Meropa had long since fled the family home to escape the cruelty of her father and brother. There was no dramatic confrontation, no lengthy explanation of motives or methods. Tom simply appeared in the doorway of the shack, like death itself come calling, spoke the words that ended Marvolo's life with casual efficiency, and watched as the last patriarch of the gaunt line crumpled to the floor of his decrepit home. The ring came off the dead man's finger as easily as a whisper, as if it had been waiting for this moment of transition from one hand to another, from one master to the next. Tom held it up to the moonlight, streaming through the shack's dirty windows, studying the way the black stone seemed to absorb the silver radiance and give nothing back. It was perfect for his purposes, ancient, powerful, and connected to Slytherin's own legacy. The ritual of creating his second Horcrux took place in the very room where Marvolo had died, with the old man's body still cooling nearby, and the night wind whistling through gaps in the shack's walls like the voices of the restless dead. Tom spoke the incantations with the same cold precision he brought to all his magical workings, and felt again the terrible tearing sensation as another fragment of his soul was split away and pressed into the waiting stone. The ring accepted its dark burden with an hunger that seemed almost alive. The black stone grew darker still, if such a thing was possible, and the gold band seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy that made the very air around it thick and oppressive. It was done. His second Horcrux was complete, and another step had been taken on his journey toward immortality. But Tom was nothing if not careful in his planning. He placed the ring carefully on Morfin's finger as the man slept off the effects of his latest drinking bout, modified the unstable wizard's memory to include false recollections of killing his father in a fit of rage, and slipped away into the night like smoke dispersing on the wind. When the ministry investigators arrived the next morning, they found exactly what Tom had intended them to find: a clear case of family violence, with a murderer who confessed readily under the influence of Veritaserum. Morfin was taken to Azkaban, where he would spend the remainder of his life insisting to anyone who would listen that he had not killed his father, that someone else had been there that night. But his protests fell on deaf ears, dismissed as the ravings of a man driven mad by guilt and the corrupting influence of dark magic. The truth of what had really happened in the Gaunt Shack died with him in his cold prison cell years later. Meanwhile, Tom took the ring far from Little Hangleton to a hiding place he had chosen with characteristic care and forethought. In the ruins of his grandfather's house, the same building where the Riddle family had lived and died, he created a protective enchantment of such complexity and malice that it would have challenged even the most skilled curse breakers. The ring was hidden beneath floorboards that had not felt footsteps for decades, protected by spells that would kill anyone foolish enough to disturb its rest. There the ring waited, patient as only objects touched by dark magic can be patient, through the years of Tom's transformation into Lord Voldemort, through his first rise to power and his subsequent downfall at the hands of a baby named Harry Potter. It lay in darkness and silence while the wizarding world celebrated the end of the Dark Lord's reign, while Harry grew from infant to child to teenager, while Dumbledore searched tirelessly for clues to the mystery of Voldemort's continued existence. The ring's slumber lasted over 50 years, but Albus Dumbledore was nothing if not persistent in his investigations. The greatest wizard of his age had recognized the signs of Horcrux magic in Voldemort's survival of the killing curse that had rebounded upon him in Godric's Hollow. Piece by piece, clue by careful clue, Dumbledore assembled the truth of what Tom Riddle had done to achieve his twisted immortality. The search led him eventually to the Gaunt family history, to records of their connection to Slytherin, to the investigation of Morphin's imprisonment, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding Marvolo's death, with the patience of someone who understood that some mysteries could only be unraveled thread by careful thread. Dumbledore traced Tom's movements in those crucial years when he had been creating his Horcruxes. The discovery of the ring's hiding place came on a summer evening, much like the one when Tom had first visited the Gaunt Shack, with the air heavy with the promise of rain and the countryside drowsing in golden twilight. Dumbledore approached the ruins of the Riddle house with the careful steps of someone who knew he was walking into danger, his aged face grave with the knowledge of what he was about to attempt. The protective enchantments were indeed formidable, layered upon each other like the petals of a deadly flower. But Dumbledore had not earned his reputation through timidity or hesitation. With spells that sang like silver bells and incantations that glowed with the pure light of protective magic, he carefully dismantled Tom's defenses one by one, working with the precision of a master craftsman taking apart a particularly complex piece of clockwork. When he finally held the ring in his hands, when he felt the dark power radiating from the black stone like heat from a forge, even Dumbledore could not suppress a moment of recognition. Here was the Resurrection Stone, one of the 3 Deathly Hallows, the legendary artifact that could summon the dead, and wrapped around it like chains was the fragment of Voldemort's soul, twisting the stone's natural magic into something corrupt and dangerous. The temptation was almost overwhelming. The stone promised him the chance to speak once more with those he had lost. His sister Ariana, taken too soon by a curse meant for another, his friend Grindelwald's other victims, perhaps even his own parents, dead these many decades. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Dumbledore's fingers trembled on the verge of placing the ring upon his finger, of calling back the voices of the dead he so longed to hear once more. But wisdom, hard-earned through years of difficult choices and painful lessons, stayed his hand. Instead, with movements that spoke of great determination and greater sorrow, he drew the sword of Godric Gryffindor from his robes, the same weapon that had destroyed Tom's diary in the Chamber of Secrets, its blade forever enhanced by basilisk venom. The destruction of the ring was both terrible and beautiful to behold. As the sword's point pierced the black stone, light erupted from within it, not the harsh, screaming radiance that had marked the diary's destruction, but something deeper and more profound, like the light of L-stars being born in the heart of nebulae. The fragment of Voldemort's soul trapped within shrieked as it was torn from its anchor, but beneath that sound of torment was something else, a note of release, of burden finally lifted, of sorrow finding its way at last to peace. The ring cracked along ancient fault lines, the gold band tarnishing and crumbling as decades of dark magic were purged from its metal. The stone itself split like an egg, revealing within its depths not darkness, but a kind of profound emptiness, a space where something terrible had lived and where now only peace remained. But the ring's protective curses, triggered by its destruction, were not so easily defeated. Even as the Horcrux died, dark magic lanced out like lightning, striking Dumbledore's hand with curse fire that burned deeper than flesh, deeper than bone, reaching into the very essence of his being. His right hand withered and blackened as if touched by death itself, a wound that no healing magic could fully close, a reminder of the price that must sometimes be paid for victory over darkness. In the gentle quiet that followed, as the last echoes of the curse faded and the ruined ring settled into harmless fragments, Dumbledore allowed himself a moment of profound satisfaction. Another Horcrux was destroyed. Another piece of Voldemort's fractured soul was gone. Another step had been taken on the long road that would eventually lead to the Dark Lord's final defeat. The old wizard gathered the remains of the ring carefully, studying the way the metal had corroded and the stone had split, reading in their destruction the signs of magic set free from bondage. Though his hand throbbed with curse pain and his heart was heavy with the knowledge of battles yet to come, there was peace in this moment, contentment in work well done. As he walked away from the ruins of the Riddle house, his blackened hand hidden within the folds of his robes and his face serene despite the pain, Dumbledore carried with him not just the satisfaction of another victory against the darkness, but something deeper, the knowledge that even the most ancient sorrows, the most corrupted artifacts, the most twisted fragments of soul could find their way back to wholeness through sacrifice, wisdom, and love. Dear listener, as this second chapter of our gentle journey draws to its close, let yourself rest in the knowledge that even the oldest wounds can heal, that even the darkest magic can be overcome by wisdom and sacrifice. The ring that once carried centuries of sorrow and pride now lies at peace, its malevolent presence no more than a memory, and the soul fragment it held has been released from its long imprisonment. Let your breathing deepen, let your mind drift toward rest, and know that like the ring finding peace in destruction, like Dumbledore finding purpose in sacrifice, you too can release the sorrows and burdens of the day, allowing them to transform into the peaceful rest that heals all wounds and soothes all troubled spirits. Sleep now, and let the ancient sorrow fade into dreams of wisdom gained and burdens gently laid aside. In the quiet spaces between heartbeats, where memories shimmer like golden light through amber, we turn our gentle attention to another tale of darkness, transformed by courage and love. Dear listener, let your thoughts drift like autumn leaves settling upon still water as we explore the story of a cup that held centuries of kindness only to be corrupted by betrayal, and finally cleansed by the fire of loyalty and friendship. Far from the windswept moors where the gaunt family had lived and died, in the comfortable heart of London where gaslight once flickered against evening mist and carriages clattered over cobblestones worn smooth by countless wheels, there stood a row of elegant townhouses that had witnessed the passing of seasons and the changing of generations with quiet dignity. One of these houses, its windows glowing warmly against the approaching twilight, belonged to a woman whose life was dedicated to the preservation of magical artifacts and the cultivation of beauty in a world too often touched by darkness. Hepzibah Smith was her name, and she moved through her richly appointed home like a curator, tending her most precious treasures. She was a woman of considerable means and even greater enthusiasm for the magical world's history. Her ample figure draped in robes of the finest silk, her greying hair always perfectly arranged, her eyes bright with the joy of someone who had found her true calling in life. Her townhouse was a wonderland of magical antiquities, ancient wands displayed in crystal cases, rare books bound in dragonhide, tapestries that moved with their own gentle life, and artifacts from the earliest days of wizarding civilization. But among all her treasures, none held a place more dear to her heart than two particular pieces that occupied the place of honor in her private collection. These were no mere curiosities or historical oddities, but genuine relics of the Hogwarts founders themselves, items that had once belonged to the legendary witches and wizards who had built the greatest school of magic the world had ever known. The first was a locket of exquisite craftsmanship, its serpentine design immediately recognizable as the work of Salazar Slytherin himself. It was a piece of such dark beauty that it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, its emerald stones glowing with their own inner fire. But it was the second treasure that truly captured Hepzibah's heart and imagination, a cup of burnished gold that seemed to glow with its own inner warmth, decorated with engravings of badgers that appeared to move and play across its surface when the light caught them just so. This was Helga Hufflepuff's cup, one of the most precious artifacts from the golden age of Hogwarts founding. Hufflepuff, beloved among the four founders for her loyalty, her fairness, and her unwavering dedication to helping all magical children find their place in the world, had imbued her personal cup with enchantments that reflected her generous spirit. The cup had the power to enhance any liquid placed within it, turning simple pumpkin juice into nectar, transforming plain water into healing draughts, and filling even the humblest meal with the warmth of welcome and the comfort of home. For generations, the cup had passed through various hands, each owner recognizing its significance and treating it with the reverence due to such an important piece of magical history. It had graced the tables of pure-blood families who understood its worth, had been displayed in the homes of collectors who treasured its connection to Hogwarts' earliest days, and had always been cared for with the love and respect that such an artifact deserved. Hepzibah had acquired the cup through entirely legitimate means, purchasing it from the estate of a distant relative who had recognized both her passion for magical antiquities and her commitment to preserving them for future generations. She kept it in a place of honor in her drawing room, where afternoon sunlight would catch its golden surface and fill the space with gentle, dancing reflections. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of evening, when the house settled around her with comfortable familiarity, she would take the cup in her hands and marvel at the craftsmanship of its creation, at the way it seemed to pulse with benevolent magic, at the sense of peace and contentment that radiated from its ancient gold. But Hepzibah's greatest joy came not from possessing these treasures, but from sharing them with others who could appreciate their significance. She was known throughout London's magical community as a gracious hostess, someone who delighted in entertaining visitors and regaling them with stories of her collection's history and provenance. Her drawing room had become something of a salon for those interested in magical antiquities, a place where scholars, collectors, and enthusiasts could gather to discuss the finer points of magical craftsmanship and historical significance. It was this generous nature, this desire to share her passion with others, that would ultimately lead to her downfall. For among the many young wizards and witches who came to admire her collection was one whose charming exterior concealed intentions as dark as midnight in a windowless room. Tom Riddle had learned of Hepzibah's collection through his work at Borgin and Burke's, the antique shop in Knockturn Alley, where he had taken employment after graduating from Hogwarts with highest honors. His position there gave him access to the magical community's wealthiest collectors, and his natural charm and extensive knowledge of magical artifacts made him an invaluable asset to the shop's reputation. Customers trusted him, confided in him, and often invited him to view their private collections, never suspecting that behind his polite interest and scholarly questions lay the calculating mind of a future Dark Lord. Hepzibah Smith had been particularly taken with the handsome young man who displayed such impressive knowledge of magical history and such genuine enthusiasm for her treasures. Tom's visits to her townhouse became a regular occurrence, each one carefully orchestrated to deepen her trust and lower her defenses. He would arrive with flowers from Diagon Alley's finest florists, would compliment her on her latest acquisitions, would listen with apparent fascination as she told the stories behind each piece in her collection, and all the while his dark eyes would linger on the cup and locket that held places of honor in her drawing room, calculating their worth not in gold or historical significance, but in their potential as vessels for fragments of his fractured soul. The courtship, for that was truly what it was, continued for months. Tom was patient, methodical, playing the role of the devoted admirer with the skill of an accomplished actor. He brought Hepzibah gifts, complimented her appearance, listened to her stories with the attention of someone genuinely interested in her well-being. She began to look forward to his visits with the anticipation of someone who had been lonely for too long, someone who had found in this charming young man not just appreciation for her collection, but perhaps something deeper and more personal. Hepzibah's house elf, Hoki, watched these developments with the keen eyes of a servant who had spent decades caring for her mistress. The elderly elf sensed something amiss in the young wizard's too perfect manners, in the way his smile never quite reached his eyes, in the calculating way he studied the collection's most valuable pieces. But when she tried to express her concerns, Hepzibah dismissed them with the gentle condescension of someone whose heart had been touched by what she believed to be genuine affection. The end, when it came, was swift and merciless. Tom arrived at the townhouse on an autumn evening when London's streets were painted with the golden light of gas lamps and the air carried the promise of rain. Hepzibah received him in her drawing room, dressed in her finest robes and practically glowing with pleasure at his visit. She had prepared tea using her most precious china, had arranged flowers throughout the room, and had even brought out additional pieces from her collection to show him, treasures she had never displayed for any other visitor. It was then, as she proudly showed him the cup and locket, that Tom made his move. The poison was subtle, tasteless, and virtually undetectable, a concoction of his own devising that would leave no trace for Ministry investigators to discover. As Hepzibah sipped her tea and chatted about the history of her treasures, the poison began its deadly work, shutting down her systems one by one with the quiet efficiency of a candle being extinguished by a gentle breath. She died with Tom's name on her lips, still believing in the affection she thought they shared, still trusting in the young man who had brought such apparent joy into her lonely existence. Her last sight was of his face, no longer charming but cold as Winterstone, watching her final moments with the detached interest of someone observing an interesting but ultimately insignificant experiment. With Hepzibah dead and Hokey conveniently framed for her mistress's murder through carefully modified memories, Tom was free to claim his prizes. The locket would serve one purpose in his grand design, but it was the cup that called to him most strongly. Here was an artifact created by one of Hogwarts' founders, imbued with centuries of positive magic, perfect for corruption into a vessel of dark power. The ritual of creating his third Horcrux took place in the very room where Hepzibah had died, surrounded by the treasures she had loved so dearly. Tom spoke the incantations with the same cold precision he brought to all his dark magic, feeling once again the terrible sensation of his soul being torn and divided. The fragment that was split away was pressed into the waiting cup through rituals that would have horrified Helga Hufflepuff had she lived to witness what her precious creation was being forced to become. The cup accepted its dark burden with what seemed like reluctance, its golden surface dimming as malevolent magic took root within its ancient enchantments. Where once it had radiated warmth and welcome, now it pulsed with something cold and hungry, a presence that twisted the very air around it with corruption and decay. The badges engraved upon its surface seemed to writhe in eternal torment, their playful movements transformed into expressions of anguish and despair. But Tom was nothing if not cautious in his planning. The cup was too valuable, too recognizable to be hidden in some random location where it might be accidentally discovered. It needed a guardian, someone loyal enough to protect it with their life, powerful enough to keep it safe from those who might seek to destroy it. And so, he entrusted it to Bellatrix Lestrange, the most devoted and dangerous of his Death Eaters, who received the honor of safeguarding her master's soul fragment as the greatest privilege of her twisted existence. Bellatrix placed the cup in the deepest vault of Gringotts Wizarding Bank, surrounded by protective enchantments and guarded by dragons, hidden among treasures that few wizards would ever see and fewer still would dare to steal. There it waited, patient as only objects touched by dark magic can be patient, through the years of Voldemort's first rise to power, through his defeat at the hands of baby Harry Potter, through the long years when his followers believed him dead and his enemies celebrated victory. The cup's imprisonment in the depths of Gringotts lasted for decades, surrounded by gold and precious stones, but cut off from the world above, unable to spread its corruption, but equally unable to find the peace it had once known. It lay in darkness and silence, while Harry Potter grew from infant to teenager, while the wizarding world slowly healed from the wounds of Voldemort's first war, while new generations of Hogwarts students learned about Helga Hufflepuff's legacy without knowing that one of her most precious artifacts had been twisted into an instrument of evil. But evil, as the old stories tell us, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. Voldemort's return to physical form, his gathering of new followers and renewal of his war against the wizarding world, created ripples that eventually reached even the deepest vaults of Gringotts. Harry Potter, the boy who had lived to defeat the Dark Lord once and would be called upon to do so again, was growing in knowledge and power, guided by Dumbledore's wisdom and supported by friendships forged in the fires of adversity. The discovery of the cup's location came through a combination of careful detective work and desperate necessity. After Dumbledore's death, when Harry, Ron, and Hermione found themselves alone in their quest to destroy Voldemort's remaining Horcruxes, they were forced to pursue every clue, no matter how dangerous, every lead, no matter how unlikely. The trail led them through the mysteries of Bellatrix Lestrange's fierce loyalty to her master, to the investigation of which precious objects might be worthy of containing pieces of the Dark Lord's soul, through the careful analysis of Voldemort's psychology and his obsession with significant magical artifacts. Piece by piece, clue by careful clue, they assembled the truth of what lay hidden in the depths of Gringotts. The infiltration of the bank was an act of desperate courage, requiring not just magical skill, but the kind of loyalty and trust that can only exist between true friends. Disguised through Polyjuice Potion and accompanied by the Goblin Griphook, who had his own reasons for opposing Gringotts' current management, the three young wizards descended into depths that few humans had ever seen. The vault itself was a chamber of wonders and terrors, filled with treasures that gleamed in the wand light like stars scattered across a golden sky. But among all the precious objects, the cup called to them with the unmistakable aura of dark magic, its corrupted presence standing out like a discordant note in a symphony of wealth and beauty. The escape from Gringotts was as dramatic as their entry had been subtle. Riding the ancient dragon that had guarded the deepest vaults, soaring through London's sky on wings of scales and fury, they carried with them not just Hufflepuff's cup, but the knowledge that they had dealt another blow to Voldemort's carefully constructed immortality. The cup's destruction came later, in the depths of Hogwarts itself, as the final battle between light and darkness raged through corridors that had once known only learning and laughter. Hermione Granger, brilliant and brave, held one of the precious basilisk fangs they had gathered from the Chamber of Secrets, her hand steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. As the fang pierced the cup's golden surface, the reaction was immediate and violent. Dark magic poured from the wound like blood from a mortal injury, shrieking and writhing as the fragment of Voldemort's soul was torn from its anchor. But beneath the screams of the dying Horcrux was another sound, a note of release, of burden finally lifted, of ancient magic returning to its original purpose. The cup cracked along lines of stress that had been building for decades, the corruption within it finally purged by the basilisk venom's cleansing power. As the dark fragment dissolved into nothingness, the golden surface began to glow once more, with something approaching its original warmth, though it would never again hold the pure benevolence that Helga Hufflepuff had imbued within its metal. In the gentle quiet that followed the cup's destruction, as the echoes of dark magic faded and the ancient artifact settled into peaceful fragments, there was a sense of justice finally served. The cup that had been stolen through betrayal of trust, that had been corrupted through murder and dark ritual, had finally found its way back to the light through the courage and loyalty of those who fought not for power, but for love. Hermione held the broken pieces carefully, studying the way the gold had brightened and the badger engravings had returned to their playful movements. Though the cup could never be fully restored to what it had been before Tom Riddle's corruption, there was peace in its destruction, contentment in knowing that another piece of Voldemort's fractured soul had been released from its prison. The cup's end marked not just another step toward the Dark Lord's defeat, but a restoration of balance to the magical world. Where once there had been corruption masquerading as treasure, now there was the simple truth of destruction serving justice. Where once there had been betrayal of trust rewarded with murder, now there was loyalty and friendship triumphing over deception and greed. Dear listener, as this third chapter of our gentle journey draws to its close, let yourself rest in the knowledge that even the most precious treasures, when corrupted by evil, can find their way back to peace through the courage of those who value friendship over power, truth over deception, and love over the promise of immortality. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let your mind drift toward the quiet spaces where trust lives and friendship grows. And know that like Hufflepuff's cup finding peace in destruction, like Hermione's courage cleansing ancient corruption, you too can release the betrayals and disappointments of the day, allowing them to transform into the peaceful rest that restores faith and renews hope. Sleep now. Let the stolen trust find its way back to loyalty. Let the corrupted treasure become simple peace, and dream of golden cups that hold not dark magic, but the simple warmth of friendship freely given and gratefully received. In the deep hours of night, when shadows dance with moonbeams and the world holds its breath between one day and the next, we turn our gentle attention to perhaps the most painful chapter in our story of fragments seeking wholeness. Dear listener, let your spirit settle like mist upon still waters as we explore the tale of a locket that carried the weight of ancient pride, the burden of family secrets, and ultimately found its peace through the triumph of friendship over the whispers of doubt and despair. In the heart of London, where narrow streets twisted like ribbons through neighborhoods both grand and humble, there stood a house that had witnessed more secrets than most buildings are ever asked to keep. Number 12. Grimmauld Place was its address, though few passers-by would have noticed it tucked between its more visible neighbors, hidden by magic that made it nearly invisible to those who had no business seeking it. This was the ancestral home of the Black family, one of the oldest and most complex pure-blood dynasties in Wizarding Britain. The house itself seemed to breathe with the weight of centuries, its walls lined with portraits of long-dead family members whose painted eyes followed visitors with expressions ranging from mild disapproval to outright hostility. Dusty tapestries depicted the family tree in golden thread, though several names had been burned away with deliberate precision, evidence of the Black family's tradition of disowning those who dared to disagree with their sacred beliefs about blood purity and magical supremacy. Among the many treasures that filled the house's dimly lit rooms, gathered over generations of wealth and influence, was a locket of extraordinary beauty and dark significance. It was not merely jewelry, this serpentine masterpiece that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, but a genuine relic of Salazar Slytherin himself, one of the 4 founders of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and the ancestor of bloodlines that valued their heritage above all else. The locket had come to the Black family through marriage, inheritance, and the careful cultivation of pure blood connections that stretched back through centuries of wizarding history. It was worn with pride by the family's matriarchs, displayed with reverence in their drawing rooms, and treasured as proof of their connection to magical nobility. The serpent that formed its design seemed to move with its own subtle life, its emerald eyes glowing with an inner fire that spoke of power, both ancient and enduring. But the locket's journey through the Black family line was not destined to be one of simple inheritance from parent to child. For the Blacks, like many pure-blood families, carried within their ranks those who would challenge tradition, who would choose love over lineage, who would dare to believe that blood status mattered less than the content of one's character. Regulus Arcturus Black was one such challenger, though his rebellion would take a form that few could have predicted. The younger son of Orion and Walburga Black, he had grown up in the shadow of his older brother Sirius, whose open defiance of family values had eventually led to his disownment and exile from the family home, where Sirius had rebelled loudly and publicly, choosing Gryffindor House over Slytherin tradition and befriending those the family considered beneath their notice. Regulus had seemed to follow a more conventional path. He was sorted into Slytherin House as expected, excelled in his studies, as was proper for a Black, and even joined the Death Eaters when Lord Voldemort's influence began to spread through the pure-blood community like silk scarves in a gentle breeze. To his parents and their social circle, Regulus appeared to be everything Sirius was not: dutiful, respectful, properly proud of his heritage, and willing to serve the cause of blood purity. But appearances, as the wisest among us know, can be more deceiving than the most carefully crafted illusion. Regulus Black carried within his heart a capacity for love and loyalty that ran deeper than family obligation, stronger than ideological commitment, more powerful than fear of death itself. And it was this love, his devotion to Creature, the house elf who had served the Black family for decades, that would ultimately lead him to make the most important choice of his young life. The story of how Salazar Slytherin's locket became one of Voldemort's Horcruxes had begun years earlier, in the comfortable drawing room of Hepzibah Smith, where Tom Riddle had charmed his way into the trust of a lonely collector and murdered her for her treasures. But the locket's transformation from family heirloom to vessel of dark magic was only the beginning of its journey through shadow and suffering. Voldemort had hidden the locket with characteristic cunning, placing it in a cave by the sea where dark waters lapped against stone walls worn smooth by centuries of tides. The hiding place was protected by enchantments of such malevolent complexity that they challenged even his own considerable magical abilities, a basin of potion that demanded a terrible price from anyone who would drink it, in fairy that slumbered beneath black water until disturbed, and curses that fed on fear and despair. It was to this awful place that Voldemort brought Kreacher when he needed a test subject for his protective enchantments. Someone expendable whose suffering would mean nothing to him, but whose magical nature would make him a suitable guinea pig for the horrors he had devised. The ancient house elf, bound by the magic that connected all his kind to their wizarding families, was forced to drink the potion that guarded the locket's hiding place, to endure agony beyond description, to face the reanimated dead that rose from the water to drag him down. But Kreacher survived, as house elves are often more resilient than the wizards who command them realize. He managed to escape the cave, to return to Grimmauld Place, where he collapsed in the kitchen he had tended for so many years, his body racked with the after effects of the potion, and his mind filled with memories of torment that would haunt his dreams for months to come. When Regulus found his beloved house elf in such a state, when he learned through patient questioning and gentle care what had been done to the creature who had raised him with more genuine affection than his own parents had ever shown, something fundamental shifted in the young wizard's understanding of the cause he had chosen to serve. The Death Eaters had presented themselves as the protectors of magical tradition, the guardians of ancient ways, the champions of those bloodlines that connected the wizarding world to its noble past. But here was Kreacher, a being whose loyalty and service embodied the very best of those ancient traditions, treated with casual cruelty by the Master Regulus, had sworn to follow. Here was proof that Voldemort's vision of magical supremacy was built not on respect for the old ways, but on the systematic destruction of everything that made those ways meaningful: loyalty, honor, the bonds between wizard and magical creature, the very concept of noblesse oblige that should have guided those born to positions of privilege and power. The realization came to Regulus slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape that had been hidden in darkness for too long. He began to see the truth behind Voldemort's promises, to understand that the Dark Lord's vision of the future was not one that preserved magical tradition, but one that corrupted it beyond recognition. The young man who had joined the Death Eaters out of family pressure and misguided idealism found himself face to face with the reality of what he had helped to create. But knowledge, as any Slytherin learns early, is only powerful when it is acted upon with cunning and careful planning. Regulus could not simply abandon the Death Eaters. Such defection would mean death not just for himself, but for Kreacher and anyone else Voldemort chose to punish for his betrayal. Instead, he began to plan with the calculating intelligence that had made him a perfect Slytherin student, working out a way to strike at his former master while protecting those he loved from the inevitable retaliation. The plan that took shape in his mind was audacious in its simplicity and heartbreaking in its necessary sacrifice. Through careful research and patient observation, Regulus had deduced the truth about Voldemort's Horcruxes, the dark magic that allowed the Dark Lord to survive death by anchoring fragments of his soul to objects in the physical world. If he could destroy one of these Horcruxes, he would weaken Voldemort and prove to himself that redemption was possible, even for those who had walked too far down the path of darkness. The cave by the sea called to him with the terrible magnetism of a challenge that must be faced, a wrong that must be righted, a test of courage that would prove whether he was truly his brother's equal in the courage to stand against family tradition when conscience demanded it. But Regulus would not face this challenge alone. Creature would accompany him, not as a victim this time, but as partner in an act of defiance that would echo through the years to come. The journey to the cave took place on a night when storm clouds gathered over the coast like an army marshalling for battle, when lightning painted the sky in brief, brilliant moments of illumination, and when the very air seemed to thrum with the power of magic, both light and dark, preparing for confrontation. Regulus and Creature travelled by magic that left no trace, appearing on the rocky shore where waves crashed against stone with the rhythm of a giant's heartbeat. The cave's entrance was hidden behind enchantments that would have challenged most adult wizards, but Regulus had come prepared with knowledge gained through careful research and the kind of determination that makes even the most complex magic yield to a focused will. With Creature at his side, he navigated the passages that led deep into the earth, following paths that seemed to pulse with malevolent purpose. When they reached the underground lake where the locket waited in its basin of cursed potion, Regulus felt the full weight of what he was attempting to do. The protective enchantments were more terrible than even his research had prepared him for. The potion that must be consumed radiated an aura of such concentrated suffering that it made the air itself difficult to breathe, while the waters beyond stirred with movements that spoke of unquiet dead, waiting for the chance to drag the living down into their eternal rest. But love, as the greatest wizards have always known, is the most powerful magic of all. Regulus's love for Creature, his determination to right the wrong that had been done to the faithful house elf, his growing understanding of what honor truly meant. All of these combined to give him the strength to face what lay ahead. The plan they executed was born of desperate necessity and deep affection. Creature would use his house elf magic to switch the true locket for a fake one that Regulus had prepared, while Regulus himself would drink the potion that guarded the basin, accepting the agony that Voldemort had intended for others, taking upon himself the suffering that the Dark Lord dealt out so casually to those he considered expendable. As the cursed liquid passed his lips, Regulus felt his mind and body assaulted by torments that seemed designed to break not just his physical form, but his very spirit. The potion showed him visions of his worst fears, his deepest regrets, his most painful memories magnified until they became unbearable. He saw Sirius falling through the veil at the ministry, saw Creature tortured beyond endurance, saw the wizarding world burning under Voldemort's rule, while he stood by helplessly, powerless to prevent the suffering of innocent people. But through it all, Creature remained at his side, the house elf's loyalty a lifeline in the storm of magical torment. When Regulus could drink no more, when his body convulsed with the potion's effects and his mind reeled under its psychological assault, Creature was there to complete their mission, switching the lockets with speed born of desperate love and carrying the real Horcrux away from its place of power. The inferi that rose from the black water as the enchantments detected the theft were terrible to behold. Corpses animated by dark magic, their dead eyes glowing with malevolent purpose, their grasping hands reaching for the living warmth of those who had dared to disturb their rest. But Regulus had planned for this too, using the last of his strength to create a barrier of fire that held the dead at bay long enough for Creature to escape with the locket. The young Black Heir's last sight was of Creature disappearing with a pop of house elf magic, carrying with him both the locket and Regulus's final command, to destroy the Horcrux by any means necessary, to complete the mission that Regulus himself would not live to finish. As the Inferi closed around him and dragged him down into the dark water, Regulus died knowing that he had chosen love over fear, sacrifice over self-preservation, honor over the easy path of continued service to evil. But Horcruxes, as Creature discovered through months of desperate attempts, are not easily destroyed. The locket resisted every effort to break it, to burn it, to tear it apart through physical or magical means. It sat in the kitchen at Grimmauld Place like a malevolent presence, whispering to anyone who came near it, filling the house with an aura of corruption that made even the permanently stuck portrait of Mrs. Black seem pleasant by comparison. For years, the locket remained hidden in the very heart of the Order of the Phoenix's headquarters, its dark influence seeping through the house like poison through veins, affecting the moods and tempers of everyone who spent time there without anyone understanding why. It watched through Regulus's sacrifice had been for nothing, that the fragment of Voldemort's soul it contained was safe from harm, that the Dark Lord's plan for immortality remained intact. But evil, as we have learned, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. The locket's presence at Grimmauld Place would eventually lead to its discovery by Harry Potter and his friends, who are following the same trail of clues that had led Regulus to his heroic sacrifice years earlier. The true story of what had happened in the cave would emerge through Creature's tearful confession, revealing not just the location of another Horcrux, but the courage of a young man who had died trying to make amends for his mistakes. The hunt for the locket led Harry, Ron, and Hermione on a journey that tested their friendship in ways they had never imagined. For months they searched for traces of the artifact, following leads that led nowhere, pursuing rumors that dissolved like mist before they could grasp them. The locket, when they finally obtained it from the thief who had stolen it from Grimmauld Place, proved to be more than just a repository of dark magic. It was a weapon designed to attack the bonds that held people together. Worn around the neck, the locket whispered poisonous thoughts into the wearer's mind, magnifying doubts and fears, turning small annoyances into major grievances, making friends see enemies where none existed. It fed on negative emotions like a parasite, growing stronger as it made its victims weaker, more isolated, more desperate. Under its influence, even the strongest friendships began to crack. The most loyal hearts began to doubt. The most courageous spirits began to falter. Ron Weasley, whose insecurities about his place in the group had always been his greatest weakness, proved most susceptible to the locket's malevolent influence. The artifact whispered to him of his inadequacies, his failures, his friends' supposed lack of respect for him. It painted pictures in his mind of Harry and Hermione falling in love while excluding him, of his own insignificance in the grand struggle against Voldemort, of a future where he would be forgotten while his friends achieved greatness. The night Ron left them, abandoning the quest in a moment of despair and self-doubt, marked the locket's greatest triumph and the beginning of its ultimate defeat. For friendship, like love, is strongest when it is tested, most powerful when it seems most fragile. most precious when its value is truly understood. Harry and Hermione's grief at Ron's departure, their refusal to abandon hope, despite the locket's whispering influence, their determination to continue their mission despite the seeming impossibility of success. All of these were evidence that the bonds between them ran deeper than any dark magic could reach. When Ron returned, guided by the deluminator that Dumbledore had left him and drawn by his own recognition of what he had nearly thrown away, he brought with him not just renewed determination, but the means to destroy the locket once and for all. The Sword of Gryffindor appeared to him in the forest pool, where he had retrieved it through an act of courage that proved his worth to himself as much as to his friends. Carried within its blade the basilisk venom that could destroy Horcruxes. The locket's destruction was both terrible and necessary to witness. As the sword pierced its heart, the fragment of Voldemort's soul trapped within fought back with visions designed to break Ron's spirit, showing him his greatest fears made manifest, his deepest insecurities given form, his worst nightmares brought to life. But Ron faced these visions with the courage of someone who had learned the true value of friendship, who had experienced the pain of losing it and the joy of finding it again. As the dark magic died and the locket cracked along lines of ancient stress, there was a moment of profound silence, not the oppressive quiet of evil's presence, but the peaceful stillness that comes when a long struggle finally reaches its end. The whispers that had plagued them for months were gone, the weight of malevolent influence lifted from their shoulders. The air itself seemed cleaner and easier to breathe. In the gentle aftermath of the locket's destruction, as Harry and Hermione embraced their returned friend, and the three of them stood together in the forest where so many of their adventures had begun, there was a sense of healing that went deeper than the mere elimination of a dark magical artifact. The locket that had tried to break their bonds had instead made those bonds stronger. The Horcrux that had fed on doubt and fear had been destroyed by loyalty and love. The fragment of soul that had sought to divide them had been overcome by their choice to remain united. Regulus Black's sacrifice, unknown to them in that moment, had finally found its completion. The young man who had died trying to destroy a piece of Voldemort's soul had his mission fulfilled by three teenagers who understood, as he had learned too late, that some things are worth more than life itself. Friendship, loyalty, love, and the courage to stand together against the darkness that seeks to tear us apart. Dear listener, as this fourth chapter of our gentle journey draws to its close, let yourself rest in the knowledge that even the most painful divisions can be healed, that friendship tested by darkness emerges stronger than ever, and that the bonds between those who truly care for one another cannot be broken by any magic, no matter how dark or persistent. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let your mind drift toward the peaceful spaces where friendship lives and loyalty grows, and know that like the locket finding its end through courage and love, like Ron discovering his own worth through loss and return, you too can release the doubts and fears of the day, allowing them to dissolve into the quiet rest that reminds us of what truly matters. Sleep now, and let the broken bonds be mended. Let the whispered doubts fade into silence, and dream of friendships that grow stronger through testing, of loyalty that deepens through trial, and of love that conquers even the darkest magic ever created. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world rests between the wisdom of yesterday and the promise of tomorrow, we turn our gentle attention to a tale of intelligence corrupted and wisdom lost, yet ultimately redeemed through the fire of sacrifice and the courage of unexpected heroes. Dear listener, let your thoughts drift like morning mist through ancient halls as we explore the story of a diadem that carried the brilliance of ages, only to be darkened by ambition and finally cleansed by flames that burned away centuries of sorrow. High in the mountains of Scotland, where eagles soared between peaks touched by eternal snow, and streams ran crystal clear through valleys painted with heather and wild roses, there stood a castle that had become legend even in its own time. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry rose from its foundations, like a dream made manifest, its towers reaching toward the stars, as if to bridge the gap between earthly learning and celestial wisdom. Among the 4 founders who had given their vision and their magic to create this haven of learning, none was more devoted to the pursuit of knowledge than Rowena Ravenclaw. She was wisdom personified, her mind as sharp as winter air and as deep as mountain lakes that reflected the sky's infinite expanse, where Godric Gryffindor valued courage, where Helga Hufflepuff treasured loyalty, where Salazar Slytherin prized ambition. Rowena Ravenclaw held intelligence and learning as the highest virtues a witch or wizard could possess. Her personal diadem was a thing of ethereal beauty, crafted from precious metals that seemed to capture starlight and hold it prisoner within their gleaming surfaces. Upon its delicate band were inscribed the words that would become the motto of her house: "Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure." The diadem was more than mere decoration. It was imbued with enchantments that enhanced the clarity of thought, sharpened the focus of concentration, and allowed its wearer to access knowledge with unprecedented ease and understanding. Students and teachers alike spoke in hushed whispers of the diadem's powers, of how it seemed to make Rowena Ravenclaw even more brilliant than nature had already made her, of the way it caught the light during her lectures and seemed to pulse with its own inner radiance when she was deep in contemplation of some particularly complex magical theory. It was said that wearing the diadem allowed one to see connections between seemingly unrelated concepts, to understand the underlying patterns that governed magical law, to grasp truths that remained hidden from ordinary minds. But wisdom, as the ancient stories tell us, is not always passed down unchanged from one generation to the next. Sometimes it is lost, sometimes it is corrupted, and sometimes it is stolen by those who mistake information for understanding, cleverness for true intelligence, the accumulation of facts for genuine wisdom. Helena Ravenclaw, Rowena's only daughter, grew up in the shadow of her mother's extraordinary reputation. She was brilliant in her own right, possessed of a sharp mind and an insatiable curiosity about the magical world. But she lived with the constant awareness that she would always be compared to the founder of Ravenclaw House, always measured against the woman whose very name had become synonymous with academic excellence and intellectual achievement. The pressure of such expectations might have been crushing for a lesser spirit, but Helena channeled her feelings into a fierce determination to prove herself worthy of her heritage. She excelled in every subject, mastered spells that challenged students years older than herself, and earned the respect of her teachers through dedication and natural ability. Yet still, She felt the weight of living up to her mother's legend. Still, she sensed the subtle whispers that followed her through the corridors. Not malicious, but wondering, speculating about whether the daughter could ever truly match the mother. As Helena grew from child to young woman, as she watched her mother age gracefully while continuing to add to her store of knowledge and wisdom, a new feeling began to grow within her heart alongside her love and admiration. It was envy, pure and simple, not for her mother's success, but for the ease with which that success had come, for the natural gifts that seemed to make learning effortless, for the diadem that enhanced abilities that were already extraordinary. The theft, when it finally occurred, was as much an act of desperation as of malice. Helena waited until her mother was deep in research in the library, surrounded by ancient texts and lost in contemplation of some theoretical question that would occupy her for hours. Then, with the stealth that intelligence can provide when turned to dark purposes, she entered her mother's private chambers and took the diadem from its place of honor. The artifact seemed to sing as she lifted it from its resting place, its metal warm to the touch, and its enchantments already beginning to work their magic on her mind. For a moment, as she held her mother's greatest treasure in her hands, Helena felt the intoxicating rush of enhanced intelligence, the clarity of thought that came with wearing an object created by one of history's greatest magical minds. But guilt, that most human of emotions, quickly followed the initial euphoria. Helena knew that what she had done was wrong, knew that her mother would be devastated by the betrayal, knew that she could never remain at Hogwarts once the theft was discovered. And so she made the decision that would seal both their fates. She fled into the night, taking the diadem with her, seeking some distant place where she might use its power to become the brilliant witch she had always dreamed of being. The chase that followed became the stuff of legend, though the full truth of it would not be known for centuries. Rowena Ravenclaw, discovering her daughter's betrayal and the loss of her most precious possession, fell into a grief so profound that it began to affect her very health. The brilliant mind that had contributed so much to Hogwarts' founding started to fade, not through age or illness, but through the kind of heartbreak that can only come from being betrayed by someone you love more than life itself. Yet even in her anguish, Rowena's love for her daughter remained unchanged. She could not bear the thought of Helena facing the dangers of the world alone, could not accept that their last interaction would be one of theft and betrayal. And so she sent someone to find Helena, to bring her home, to offer forgiveness and the chance to heal the wounds that pride and envy had torn in their relationship. The person she chose for this mission was someone who loved Helena almost as much as Rowena herself did, the Bloody Baron, a young nobleman who had long sought Helena's hand in marriage and whose devotion to her was as fierce as it was unrequited. He rode out from Hogwarts with hope in his heart and determination in his soul, believing that his love could succeed where Rowena's maternal authority had failed. The confrontation between Helena and the Baron took place in a forest in Albania, where ancient trees whispered secrets in languages older than human speech, and shadows danced with mysteries that predated the founding of civilization. Helena had been hiding there for months, using the diadem's enhanced intelligence to master spells and acquire knowledge at a rate that would have impressed even her mother, but finding no peace in her achievements, no satisfaction in powers gained through theft and betrayal. When the Baron found her at last, when he pleaded with her to return home and accept her mother's forgiveness, Helena's response came not from the enhanced intelligence the diadem provided, but from the wounded pride and stubborn independence that had driven her to flee in the first place. She refused his pleas, scorned his offers of love and protection, and in a moment of cruel insight enhanced by the diadem's magic, spoke words designed to wound him as deeply as she herself had been wounded by years of living in her mother's shadow. The Baron's reaction was swift and terrible, driven by a passion that overwhelmed his reason and a despair that consumed his better judgment. In a moment of rage and heartbreak, he drew his dagger and struck the blow that would make Helena Ravenclaw the Grey Lady, eternal spirit of Ravenclaw Tower, forever walking the halls of the school her mother had helped to found. But even as Helena fell, even as her life's blood seeped into the forest floor, and her spirit began its transition from flesh to ghostly existence, the Baron realized the magnitude of what he had done. Unable to live with the knowledge that he had destroyed the woman he claimed to love, unable to face Rowena Ravenclaw with news of her daughter's death, he turned the dagger upon himself and joined Helena in the realm of the dead, becoming the bloody Baron whose chains would forever remind him of his crime. The diadem, meanwhile, remained hidden where Helena had concealed it in her final moments, buried beneath the roots of an ancient oak tree in the Albanian forest, protected by spells of concealment that even death could not break. There it would rest for centuries, its location known only to Helena's spirit and shared with no living soul, its power unused but not diminished, waiting with the patience that only magical objects can possess. The years passed like pages turning in an endless book, and still the diadem remained hidden in its forest grave. Empires rose and fell. Magical knowledge advanced and sometimes regressed, and generations of Hogwarts students learned and graduated and went out into the world, never knowing that one of their school's most precious artifacts lay buried in distant earth, its wisdom locked away from those who might have benefited from its gifts. It was not until the 20th century when a young wizard named Tom Riddle began his own quest for objects of power and significance that the diadem's long slumber was disturbed. Through research that was as thorough as it was patient, through careful questioning of Hogwarts's ghosts, an investigation of the school's most obscure historical records, Tom pieced together the truth of Helena Ravenclaw's story and the location of her mother's lost treasure. The journey to Albania was undertaken with characteristic planning and preparation, Tom moving through the ancient forest like a shadow seeking its substance, following clues that had been hidden for centuries. When he finally found the diadem beneath its oak tree guardian, when he held in his hands an artifact created by one of Hogwarts' founders, he felt the same surge of triumph that had marked each of his previous acquisitions of historically significant magical objects. But Tom's interest in the diadem was not academic or even acquisitive in the ordinary sense. By this time, he had already created several Horcruxes, had already begun his transformation into the Dark Lord Voldemort, and his purpose in seeking out objects of power was always the same: to serve as vessels for fragments of his fractured soul, anchors that would prevent death from claiming him as it claimed lesser wizards. The murder that would enable him to split his soul once again and create his fifth Horcrux was committed with the same cold efficiency that marked all his dark work. An Albanian peasant, someone whose death would go unnoticed and uninvestigated, provided the necessary act of killing, and the ritual that followed pressed another fragment of Tom's essence into the waiting diadem. The artifact that had once enhanced Rowena Ravenclaw's already extraordinary intelligence now pulsed with malevolent purpose, its original enchantments twisted and corrupted by the presence of the Dark Lord's soul. Where it had once clarified thought and sharpened focus, it now whispered dark thoughts and cruel inspirations. Where it had once been a tool of learning and discovery, it became an instrument of manipulation and control. Tom brought the corrupted diadem back to Hogwarts when he returned to seek the defense against the dark arts position, hiding it in the room of requirement among thousands of other objects that students had concealed over the centuries. There, surrounded by broken furniture and forgotten treasures, protected by the room's own magic and hidden among artifacts that had accumulated like sediment over decades of use, the diadem waited once again. Its presence in the castle where it had been created added a layer of tragic irony to its story. The very halls where Rowena Ravenclaw had taught and learned, where Helena had grown up in the shadow of her mother's brilliance, where the pursuit of knowledge was still held as the highest virtue, these same corridors now harbored a piece of the Dark Lord's soul, a fragment of evil that corrupted the very air it touched. For decades, the diadem remained hidden in the room of requirement, its malevolent influence seeping through the castle like poison through veins, affecting the moods and thoughts of students and teachers who came near it without ever understanding why they felt uneasy, why their dreams were sometimes troubled by whispers they couldn't quite remember upon waking. But darkness, as our story has shown us again and again, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. The diadem's presence at Hogwarts would eventually lead to its discovery by Harry Potter, who had learned to recognize the particular quality of malevolent magic that marked Voldemort's Horcruxes, who understood that the Dark Lord's obsession with the school would naturally lead him to hide his treasures within its walls. The search for the diadem took place during the most desperate hours of the final battle between light and darkness, when Voldemort's forces had surrounded Hogwarts, and every moment of delay brought the school closer to destruction. Harry's quest led him through corridors filled with the echoes of combat, past classrooms where spells flew like deadly flowers and shields sparked with the impact of curses meant to kill. The room of requirement, when Harry finally reached it, revealed itself as a cavern of lost things, a repository of centuries' worth of hidden objects that rose like mountains of memory around him. Students had been concealing things there for generations. Broken wands, failed experiments, love letters never sent, treasures both precious and worthless, all of them accumulated into a landscape of forgotten dreams and abandoned hopes. Finding the diadem among such a collection might have been impossible for anyone less determined, but Harry's connection to Voldemort, the unwilling link forged by the fragment of the Dark Lord's soul that resided within his own being, led him to the corrupted artifact with the unerring instinct of iron drawn to lodestone. The diadem sat atop a dusty wardrobe like a crown waiting for its rightful wearer, its metal still beautiful despite the centuries of concealment, its original craftsmanship still evident beneath the dark aura of corruption that surrounded it. But there was no time for admiration or historical reflection. The battle raging outside would not wait for archaeological appreciation, and every moment spent in the room of requirement brought Voldemort closer to his goal of conquering the wizarding world. It was then that Vincent Crabbe, in an act of desperate malice and frustrated rage, unleashed the most dangerous fire magic he had ever attempted, Fiendfire, a cursed flame that burned with the hunger of demons and the destructive power of elemental fury. The fire that erupted from his wand was not the clean, controlled flame of ordinary magic, but something primal and terrible, a conflagration that fed on magic itself and grew stronger with each object it consumed. The room of requirement became an inferno in seconds, the accumulated treasures of centuries turning to fuel for flames that roared with voices like tormented souls. Crabbe's Fiendfire burned everything it touched, reducing priceless artifacts to ash, destroying memories and dreams with the impartial hunger of elemental destruction. But in that same terrible fire lay the salvation Harry had been seeking. For Fiendfire, among its many terrible properties, possessed the power to destroy Horcruxes, to burn away not just the physical objects that served as anchors for fragments of soul, but the dark magic itself, purging corruption with cleansing flame. As the diadem was consumed by Crabbe's uncontrolled fire, as the metal melted and the enchantments burned away like cobwebs in a hurricane, the fragment of Voldemort's soul trapped within shrieked its way into oblivion. The corruption that had twisted Rowena Ravenclaw's creation for decades was finally purged. The dark magic that had made wisdom into a tool of evil was finally destroyed. The fifth Horcrux was finally, irrevocably gone. In the moment of the diadem's destruction, those sensitive to such things might have felt a shift in the magical atmosphere of Hogwarts itself, as if some long-standing burden had been lifted from the ancient stones. The castle that had been home to both Helena's theft and the diadem's corruption could finally breathe easily again, could finally be free of the malevolent presence that had haunted its halls for so many years. The fire that consumed the diadem also claimed Vincent Crabbe, whose mastery of the dark magic he had unleashed proved insufficient to control its destructive power. He became victim of his own malice, consumed by flames that cared nothing for the allegiances of those who summoned them, dying in the same moment that saw another piece of Voldemort's soul destroyed forever. But from that destruction came something beautiful, the knowledge that even the most corrupted wisdom could be cleansed, that even the most twisted intelligence could find its way back to purity through fire and sacrifice. The diadem that had enhanced Rowena Ravenclaw's brilliant mind, that had been stolen by her daughter's envy, that had been corrupted by Voldemort's evil, had finally found peace in the flames that burned away centuries of sorrow and betrayal. Helena Ravenclaw herself, the Grey Lady who had wandered Hogwarts corridors for 1,000 years, carrying the guilt of her theft and the sorrow of her mother's disappointment, felt something shift in her spectral essence as the diadem burned. The burden she had carried for so long, the knowledge that her actions had led to the loss of one of magical history's greatest treasures, was finally lifted from her ghostly shoulders. In the Great Hall, as the final battle between Harry Potter and Lord Voldemort reached its climax, those who understood the significance of the Horcruxes knew that another step had been taken toward the Dark Lord's ultimate defeat. The diadem's destruction meant that Voldemort was more mortal than he had been in decades, more vulnerable to the final confrontation that would determine the fate of the wizarding world. But perhaps most importantly, the diadem's end marked the restoration of balance to the pursuit of knowledge itself. For too long, Rowena Ravenclaw's creation had been perverted from its original purpose, turned from a tool of learning into an instrument of domination. Its destruction in the cleansing fire of Fiendfire represented not just the elimination of a Horcrux, but the symbolic victory of wisdom over cleverness, of true intelligence over mere cunning, of the genuine pursuit of knowledge over the corruption of learning for evil ends. Dear listener, as this 5th chapter of our gentle journey draws to its close, let yourself rest in the knowledge that even the greatest wisdom, when corrupted by pride or twisted by evil, can find its way back to purity through courage and sacrifice. The diadem that once enhanced the greatest magical mind of its age, that was lost through envy and betrayal, that was perverted by dark magic, has finally found its peace in cleansing flame. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let your mind drift toward the quiet spaces where true wisdom lives, and know that, like the diadem finding peace in destruction, like Helena finally released from centuries of guilt, you too can let go of the mistakes and regrets of the day, allowing them to be consumed by the gentle fire of forgiveness and the peaceful rest that comes to those who learn from their errors and choose to grow beyond them. Sleep now and let the lost wisdom find its way home. Let the stolen treasure become simple peace, and dream of intelligence guided by love, of knowledge tempered by compassion, and of learning that serves not the ego, but the greater good of all who seek to understand the mysteries of this magical world in which we live. In the deepest hour of night, when silence wraps the world like a gentle embrace, and even the wind holds its breath in reverence for the mysteries that unfold in darkness, we come to perhaps the most complex and sorrowful chapter in our tale of fragments seeking wholeness. Dear listener, let your spirit settle like snow upon winter fields as we explore the story of a creature who was both victim and vessel, both companion and Horcrux, whose final moments would teach us that even the most faithful servants of darkness can find their peace through the courage of those who understand that all living beings deserve compassion, even in their endings. Deep in the forests of Albania, where ancient trees whispered secrets in languages older than human memory, and moonlight filtered through canopies that had stood unchanged since the world was young, there lived a serpent of extraordinary size and intelligence. She was not born as other snakes are born, from eggs warmed by summer sun and tended by instinctive care, but emerged from magic both dark and transformative, a witch whose humanity had been stripped away by curses that twisted flesh and spirit until nothing remained but the primal essence of predator wrapped in scales that gleamed like polished obsidian. Her name, in the time before transformation, had been lost to history and memory alike. She had been a follower of Voldemort in his earliest incarnation, a witch drawn to his promises of power and immortality, seduced by his vision of a world where magical beings ruled over muggles with the absolute authority of gods commanding mortals. But devotion to the Dark Lord, as so many would learn too late, came with prices that could not be calculated until they had already been paid in full. The curse that transformed her was both punishment and reward, penalty and gift, degradation and elevation, all woven together into a single spell that remade her very essence. Where once she had walked upright through the world, now she moved with the fluid grace of a serpent, her body stretching to lengths that dwarfed even the great constrictors of tropical jungles. Where once she had spoken in human language, now her voice carried the sibilant power of parcel tongue, the ancient tongue of serpents that only the heirs of Salazar Slytherin could understand and speak. But perhaps most significantly, where once her mind had been merely human, bounded by the limitations of mortal intelligence and perception, now it was enhanced and expanded, capable of understanding concepts that ordinary snakes could never grasp, able to form emotional bonds and loyalty that transcended the simple survival instincts of her adopted species. She was no longer entirely human, but neither was she simply a beast. She existed in the liminal space between the two, belonging fully to neither world, yet touched by the essence of both. For years she dwelt in the Albanian forests, moving like a living shadow between trees whose roots drew sustenance from earth that had been soaked with the blood of ancient battles. She hunted when hunger demanded it, rested in hidden places when the sun grew too warm for comfort, and waited with the patience that only immortal beings can truly possess. She was waiting, though she could not have articulated for what, for someone or something that would give her existence meaning beyond mere survival. The forests around her were home to many dark things in those years, refugees from justice, creatures that shunned the light of civilization, spirits that had been banished from the world of the living, but had not yet found their way to whatever realm awaited them beyond. Among these outcasts and wanderers, she was neither feared nor revered, simply accepted as another being that had chosen darkness over light, solitude over community, the wild over the civilized world that had rejected or betrayed them. It was in this realm of shadows and outcasts that she first encountered the being who would become both her master and her destroyer, though she could not know it at the time. He came to her not in his full power and terrible majesty, but as something weak and diminished, a spirit barely able to maintain cohesion, a fragment of consciousness that clung to existence through will alone, and the kind of hatred that burns cold and eternal. Lord Voldemort, reduced to less than the meanest ghost by the rebounded killing curse that had destroyed his physical form in Godric's Hollow, had fled to these same Albanian forests where he had once hidden Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem. He was seeking not just refuge, but restoration, some way to regain the power and presence that had made him the most feared wizard of his generation. In his incorporeal state, he was vulnerable in ways he had never been before, dependent on the kindness of creatures who had little reason to show kindness to anyone or anything. The serpent found him in a clearing where starlight struggled through leaves thick enough to block most illumination, a presence more felt than seen, a disturbance in the natural order that made even the bravest forest creatures flee to safer ground. Where others sensed danger and withdrew, she was drawn by something deeper, a recognition that passed between predators, an understanding that here was something that matched her own displacement from the normal world, her own existence on the margins of light and darkness. Their first communication was tentative, conducted in the ancient language of Parseltongue that flowed between them like music written in scales and sibilants. Voldemort, even in his diminished state, possessed a charisma that could charm serpents as easily as it had once charmed witches and wizards, and she found herself responding to his presence with something she had not felt in years. A sense of purpose, meaning, were vulnerable to discovery and destruction. What he needed was a Horcrux that could move, that could defend itself, that could remain by his side where he could guard it personally while it guarded his immortality. The murder that enabled him to split his soul once again was committed with characteristic calculation, targeting a victim whose death would serve multiple purposes, eliminating a potential threat, providing the necessary act of killing for his dark ritual, and sending a message to those who might oppose him that nowhere was safe from his reach. But this time, instead of pressing the resulting soul fragment into an inanimate object, he chose a vessel that was alive, conscious, and devoted to him with unwavering loyalty. The ritual that transformed Nagini into his sixth Horcrux was unlike the others he had performed, requiring modifications to account for her living nature, her intelligence, and her existing magical properties. The magic that bound the fragment of his soul to her essence was more complex than any he had attempted before, weaving together elements of blood magic, soul binding, and the ancient arts that govern the relationship between wizard and familiar. For Nagini, the transformation was both subtle and profound. Outwardly, she remained the same magnificent serpent she had always been, her scales unmarked by the dark magic now residing within her, her movements still fluid and graceful, her intelligence undiminished by her new role as vessel for her master's immortality. But inwardly, she carried a burden she could not fully understand, a fragment of another's soul nested within her own essence, like a parasite that fed on her life force, while granting her a form of immortality she had never sought. The bond between them became something unprecedented in the annals of dark magic. Not just master and servant, not merely wizard and familiar, but something approaching a fusion of identities that blurred the lines between where Voldemort ended and Nagini began. Through their connection, he could see through her eyes when distance separated them, could communicate with her across vast expanses of space and time, could channel his magic through her body when his own was absent or weakened. In return, she experienced fragments of his memories, glimpses of his thoughts and emotions, echoes of his power that enhanced her own natural abilities until she became something far more dangerous than any ordinary serpent, no matter how large or intelligent. She was no longer merely Nagini, the transformed witch, or Nagini, the serpent companion. She was Nagini, the Horcrux, carrier of the Dark Lord's essence, guardian of his immortality, and the most loyal follower he had ever possessed. Their partnership flourished during the dark years of Voldemort's second rise to power, when his Death Eaters gathered around him like moths drawn to a flame that promised to burn away the old order and replace it with something darker and more terrible. Nagini was present at meetings where the fate of the wizarding world was planned with casual cruelty, witnessed tortures and murders that would have horrified ordinary creatures, participated in acts of violence that served her master's grand design for magical supremacy. But through it all, she remained what she had always been, a being capable of loyalty affection, and even a twisted form of love. Her devotion to Voldemort was absolute, not because she was compelled by magic or coerced by fear, but because he had given meaning to her existence, had made her feel valued and necessary in ways that her previous life had never provided. In caring for him, protecting him, serving his needs both mundane and magical, she found the closest thing to happiness that her transformed nature would allow. The irony of her situation, that she had become both protector and protected, guardian and guarded, the watcher and the watched, was lost on neither of them. Voldemort understood that in making her a Horcrux, he had created a vulnerability as well as a strength, had placed a fragment of his soul in a vessel that could be targeted, hunted, and destroyed. But the risk seemed acceptable when weighed against the advantages she provided, and her presence at his side offered comforts that no inanimate Horcrux could ever supply. As the war between Voldemort's forces and those who opposed him escalated into open conflict, as the wizarding world was torn apart by battles that would determine his future for generations to come, Nagini remained at her master's side through every triumph and setback. She witnessed his moments of glory and his periods of doubt, his brilliant strategies and his crucial mistakes, his growing confidence in ultimate victory, and his occasional flashes of something that might almost have been fear. When Harry Potter and his friends began their systematic hunt for Voldemort's Horcruxes, when they started destroying the anchors that bound the Dark Lord to life, Nagini felt each loss as a physical pain that resonated through the connection she shared with her master. The diary's destruction, the ring's cleansing, the cup's purification, the locket's release, the diadem's burning. Each death of a soul fragment sent ripples of agony through the network of dark magic that connected all of Voldemort's creations. But she also felt his growing desperation, his increasing paranoia, his dawning realization that the immortality he had sacrificed so much to achieve was not as secure as he had believed. As his other Horcruxes fell one by one to the combined efforts of those who opposed him, Voldemort began to keep her closer, to guard her more jealously, to surround her with protective enchantments that turned her from companion into treasure, from friend into possession. The final battle at Hogwarts found them together in the ancient castle where Tom Riddle had first learned of Horcrux magic, where he had created his first anchor to immortality, where the seeds of his transformation into Lord Voldemort had been planted in soil that should have nurtured wisdom and growth rather than ambition and corruption. As spells flew through corridors that had once echoed only with laughter and learning, as the fate of the wizarding world was decided in halls where children had played and dreamed of their futures, Nagini remained at her master's side, prepared to defend him with her life while carrying within her the fragment of his soul that had made such defense both necessary and futile. The end, when it finally came, arrived not through the complex magical battles that had marked so much of the war, not through elaborate strategies or powerful spells, but through the simple courage of a young man who had learned to value friendship over fame, sacrifice over survival, love over power. Neville Longbottom, the boy who had grown into a hero through trials that would have broken lesser spirits, stepped forward in the moment when courage was needed most and took upon himself the task that no one else could complete. The sword of Gryffindor, enhanced with basilisk venom, from its previous battles against the forces of darkness, sang as it fell through air thick with the magic of war and the weight of destiny. Nagini, sensing the approach of something that could destroy not just her physical form, but the very essence of what she had become, reared up in defense of her master one final time, her fangs bared and her coils ready to strike at this new threat to everything she had devoted her existence to protecting. But even as the sword descended toward her, even as she prepared to meet the death that had stalked her since the moment she became a Horcrux, there was something in her serpentine eyes that spoke not of malice or hatred, but of a kind of weary relief. The burden she had carried, the fragment of another's soul that had nested within her essence, like a weight too heavy for any single being to bear, was finally about to be lifted from her. The blade found its mark with the precision of justice finally served, cutting through scales that had been touched by dark magic and reaching the corrupted core where Voldemort's soul fragment had made its home. The reaction was immediate and violent. Light poured from the wound like liquid starfire. The fragment of soul shrieked as it was torn from its living anchor, and the protective enchantments that had surrounded her for years unraveled like tapestries, coming apart in a strong wind. But beneath the sound of the dying Horcrux, beneath the magical energies being released as dark spells broke apart, those sensitive to such things might have heard something else, a note of release, of gratitude, of a burden finally laid down after years of carrying weight that was never meant to be borne by any living creature. The serpent who had once been a witch, who had become a companion, who had been transformed into a weapon, was finally, mercifully, allowed to rest. In the moment of her death, as consciousness faded and the magical bonds that had held her in serpent form for so many years finally dissolved, Nagini experienced something she had not felt since her original transformation. Peace. The fragment of Voldemort's soul that had lived within her was gone, destroyed by the sword's cleansing power, and with it went the compulsions and connections that had defined her existence for so long. Her last sight was of Neville Longbottom, the young wizard who had found the courage to do what was necessary, and in his eyes she saw not the hatred or fear that usually greeted her presence, but something approaching compassion, recognition that she too had been a victim of Voldemort's manipulations, that her loyalty had been both her greatest virtue and her ultimate tragedy. Voldemort himself, feeling the destruction of his final Horcrux through the magical connections that bound him to all his anchors, experienced a moment of vulnerability he had not known since the night his killing curse had rebounded upon him in Godric's Hollow. The immortality he had sacrificed so much to achieve was finally and irrevocably gone, leaving him as mortal as any other wizard, as vulnerable to death as those he had killed without thought or remorse. But perhaps more significantly than his newfound mortality was the emotional impact of Nagini's destruction. She had been more than just a Horcrux to him, more than merely an anchor to life. She had been the closest thing to a friend that his dark journey had allowed him to possess. In losing her, he lost not just a fragment of his soul, but the last connection to anything resembling love or companionship that remained in his existence. The battle continued around them, spells flying like deadly flowers through air thick with magic and determination. but something fundamental had shifted in the balance between light and darkness. The servant who had been most faithful was gone. The guardian who had never failed was destroyed. And the creature who had offered the Dark Lord the only genuine affection he had ever known was finally at peace. Neville stood over Nagini's still form for a moment, the sword of Gryffindor heavy in his hands, understanding that he had just taken a life that had been caught between loyalty and corruption, devotion and destruction. There was no joy in this victory, no triumph in this necessary killing. Only the grim satisfaction of a duty completed, and the hope that the creature he had been forced to destroy had finally found the peace that had been denied her for so long. In the great hall, where the wounded were tended and the dead were mourned, where families reunited and heroes were honored, few would remember to speak of the serpent who had died not as a monster, but as a being who had been transformed against her will, corrupted by magic she had not chosen, and bound to serve darkness that she might not have embraced if other choices had been available to her. But those who understood the deeper currents of magic and morality, those who recognized that even the servants of evil could be victims of forces greater than themselves, would remember Nagini not as Voldemort's weapon or his final Horcrux, but as a creature who had learned the meaning of loyalty in the darkest circumstances, who had offered love to someone incapable of truly returning it, and who had found her peace at last in the moment when courage triumphed over fear and light finally overcame the darkness that had claimed so many. The serpent's final coil had been unraveled not just by the sword that ended her physical existence, but by the compassion of those who understood that redemption sometimes comes not through grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but through the simple recognition that all beings, no matter how fallen or corrupted, deserve to find their rest when the long struggle finally ends. Dear listener, as this 6th chapter of our gentle journey draws to its close, let yourself rest in the knowledge that even the most corrupted souls can find peace, that loyalty and love exist even in the darkest circumstances, and that sometimes the greatest mercy is release from burdens too heavy for any single being to bear alone. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let your mind drift toward the quiet spaces where forgiveness lives and understanding grows. And know that like Nagini, finding peace in her ending, like the sword bringing not just death but release, you too can lay down the burdens of the day, allowing them to dissolve into the gentle rest that comes to those who understand that even in endings there can be grace, compassion, and the promise of peace restored. Sleep now, and let the final coil unravel into rest. Let the faithful servant find her peace, and dream of loyalty rewarded not with corruption, but with the gentle mercy that comes when the struggle finally ends and the burden is finally laid down in the quiet hands of those who understand that all beings, no matter how lost, deserve to find their way home to peace at last. In the gentlest hours of dawn, when darkness gives way to light and the world awakens from dreams into the promise of new beginnings, we come at last to the most extraordinary chapter in our tale of fragments seeking wholeness. Dear listener, let your heart settle like morning dew upon grass kissed by first light as we explore the story of a boy who carried darkness within him, yet radiated light, who bore a fragment of evil's essence, yet chose love at every turn, whose very existence became the bridge between corruption and redemption. between death and life, between the broken and the whole. On a night when October winds carried the scent of dying leaves and approaching winter, when stars watched with cold brilliance over a village that slept in innocent peace, a cottage in Godric's Hollow became the stage for magic, both terrible and wonderful, for an act of love so pure and powerful that it would echo through the generations like a song that never fades. The cottage itself was modest, its windows glowing warmly against the autumn darkness, its garden peaceful in the moonlight that filtered through clouds heavy with the promise of rain. Within those walls lived a family whose love had become legendary, even among those who knew them only slightly. James and Lily Potter, young parents whose joy in each other and in their infant son seemed to make the very air around them shimmer with happiness. They had faced the darkness gathering in the wizarding world with courage that never wavered, had stood against forces that sought to tear apart everything they held dear, had chosen to fight rather than flee, even when the odds seemed impossible to overcome. Their son, Harry James Potter, was barely 15 months old on that fateful night, a child whose green eyes sparkled with a kind of innocent wonder that sees magic in every shadow and joy in every sunrise. He crawled through his nursery with the determined exploration of one discovering the world, babbling in the universal language of babies who have never known anything but love, reaching for toys and moonbeams with equal enthusiasm and delight. But evil had found them, as evil often finds those who shine brightest in the darkness, drawn like a moth to flame by the very light it seeks to extinguish. Lord Voldemort came to Godric's Hollow not as a man seeking victory, but as something far more terrible, a being so consumed by the pursuit of immortality that he had forgotten what it meant to be human, so dedicated to conquering death that he had lost all understanding of what made life worth living. The prophecy that had driven him to this moment spoke of a child born as July died, a child with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord, a threat to everything Voldemort had built and everything he hoped to become. In his arrogance and his fear, he had chosen Harry as that prophesied child, never understanding that in making this choice he would create not his victory, but the instrument of his own eventual defeat. James Potter died as he had lived, protecting those he loved with a courage that blazed like fire in the face of overwhelming darkness. He fell defending his family, his wand in his hand and defiance in his heart, buying precious moments with his life so that his wife and son might have a chance to escape the doom that had found them. His death was swift, but not meaningless, for love, given freely and completely, never truly dies. It transforms, it transcends. It becomes something greater than the sum of its mortal parts. Lily Potter faced the Dark Lord in the nursery, where her son's toys lay scattered like fallen stars, her red hair catching the strange light that seemed to emanate from Voldemort's presence. Her green eyes, the same eyes her son had inherited, blazing with a mother's fierce love and unbreakable determination. She had been offered the chance to stand aside, to save herself and let the Dark Lord do what he had come to do. But such an offer could never have been accepted by one whose love was deeper than fear, stronger than the instinct for self-preservation. Not Harry. The words that rang through the nursery carried with them all the power of ancient magic, all the strength of love that knows no compromise, no hesitation, no doubt. In choosing to die for her son, in placing herself between him and the darkness that sought to claim him, Lily Potter invoked magic older than wands, more powerful than curses, more enduring than any spell ever written in the deepest archives of magical knowledge. The killing curse that followed was spoken with all of Voldemort's considerable power behind it, green light blazing through the nursery, like a falling star seeking its target. But when it struck not Harry, but the barrier of his mother's sacrifice, something unprecedented occurred, something that had never happened in all the long history of the killing curse's use. The spell rebounded, turning back upon its caster with all the force of its original casting, seeking the life it had been meant to take, but finding instead the one who had sent it forth. Voldemort's scream of disbelief and agony shattered the windows of the cottage and sent tremors through the very foundations of the magical world. His physical form, held together by will and dark magic rather than the normal bonds of flesh and spirit, could not withstand the impact of his own curse reflected back at him. He was torn apart, his essence scattered, his body destroyed, his plans reduced to ash and bitter memory in a single, terrible instant. But the Dark Lord had prepared for death, had taken precautions that he believed would preserve him, even if his body was destroyed. The Horcruxes he had created over the years, the diary, the ring, the cup, the locket, the diadem, and the serpent waited in their hiding places, ready to anchor his soul to the mortal world and ensure his eventual return to power and form. What he had not planned for, what his understanding of magic had never encompassed, was what would happen when he tried to kill a child protected by the most powerful force in the wizarding world, a mother's love freely given. The rebounded curse tore Voldemort's already fractured soul apart even further, splitting off yet another fragment in the moment of his destruction. This piece of his essence, desperate and dying, reached out instinctively for something to anchor itself to, something that could serve as a vessel for its continued existence. The obvious choices, the various objects in the room, the remnants of toys and furniture, were rejected by magic that recognized them as insufficient, as lacking the spark of life necessary to sustain a fragment of soul. Instead, the piece of Voldemort's spirit found something else entirely, a living child whose proximity to such dark magic, whose survival of the killing curse, whose very existence in that moment of magical chaos made him uniquely suited to become an unintentional Horcrux. The soul fragment latched onto Harry with the desperate hunger of something drowning, seeking any means of survival, burrowing into the infant's essence and making itself at home behind the lightning bolt scar that would mark him for the rest of his life. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, became in that moment something unprecedented in the history of magic, a living person who carried within himself a fragment of another's soul, a child who would grow up bearing both the light of his parents' love and the darkness of his greatest enemy's essence, a walking contradiction who embodied both the best and worst of magical possibility. The scar that marked his forehead was more than just a reminder of the night his parents died. It was a window into the connection that now bound him to Lord Voldemort, a link that would shape his entire life in ways both terrible and wonderful. But the fragment of Voldemort's soul that had taken residence within Harry was not like the others, not like the pieces carefully placed in objects chosen for their significance and power. This fragment was wounded, weak, and surrounded not by dark magic designed to nurture and protect it, but by the strongest protective enchantment ever woven, the magic of Lily Potter's sacrifice, love given freely and completely, a mother's protection that would shield her son from harm for as long as her blood ran in his veins. The love that protected Harry was like sunlight to the fragment of darkness within him, constantly working to weaken and contain it, preventing it from growing stronger or exerting the kind of influence that the other Horcruxes had wielded. Where Tom Riddle's diary had been able to possess Ginny Weasley, where Slytherin's locket had whispered poisonous thoughts to those who wore it, the fragment within Harry was held in check by magic that recognized its presence as foreign and unwelcome. Years passed, and Harry grew from infant to child to teenager, never knowing the true nature of what lived within him, but always aware that he was different, that strange things happened around him, that he sometimes knew things he had no way of knowing, and felt emotions that seemed to come from somewhere outside himself. The connection between his mind and Voldemort's remained active but muted, filtered through layers of protective magic that allowed him glimpses without overwhelming him with darkness. At Hogwarts, surrounded by friends who loved him and teachers who recognized his potential, Harry flourished in ways that would have been impossible if the fragment within him had been allowed to grow unchecked. The castle itself, built by magic that valued love and learning above power and conquest, provided an environment where the best aspects of his nature could develop, while the worst were held in careful balance. His friendships with Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger became anchors of light in his life, relationships built on loyalty and trust that served as counterweights to the darkness he carried. Every act of kindness he showed, every choice to help rather than harm, every moment when he chose love over fear was a victory of his true nature over the foreign essence that shared his existence. The fragment of Voldemort within him never disappeared, but neither did it define him. Harry Potter remained himself, shaped by love rather than corrupted by hatred. The connection between Harry and Voldemort manifested in many ways over the years, shared dreams that were more than dreams, moments of pain when the Dark Lord's emotions ran high, flashes of insight into thoughts and plans that no ordinary wizard could have accessed. But each manifestation was double-edged, for if Harry could sometimes see into Voldemort's mind, the reverse was also true. The Dark Lord found himself occasionally experiencing emotions he had thought long dead: compassion, friendship, selflessness, feelings that came not from his own corrupted heart, but from the boy who carried a piece of his soul. As Harry grew older and the magical world around him grew darker, as Voldemort returned to physical form and gathered his followers for another attempt at conquest, the connection between them grew stronger and more dangerous. The fragment within Harry began to stir more frequently, to push more strongly against the bonds of love that contained it, to seek reunion with the greater whole from which it had been separated. But Harry had advantages that no other Horcrux had possessed. He had friends who would die for him, mentors who understood the nature of sacrifice, and a community that recognized his worth as more than just a weapon against darkness. Most importantly, he had been raised by magic that valued love above all else, that taught him to see strength in vulnerability, power in gentleness, victory in the willingness to sacrifice oneself for others. The truth about what he carried within himself came to him slowly, through careful revelation by those who loved him enough to help him understand without being crushed by the knowledge. Dumbledore, who had suspected the truth from the beginning, guided Harry toward an understanding of his unique nature with the patience of someone who knew that some lessons can only be learned when the student is ready to receive them. The revelation that he was himself a Horcrux, that a part of Voldemort's soul lived within him, that his survival of the killing curse had made him a living vessel for his enemy's essence. This knowledge might have broken a lesser spirit, might have driven someone else to despair or madness. But Harry had been shaped by love, had learned through years of friendship and sacrifice that identity comes not from what we carry, but from what we choose to do with what we've been given. When he learned that Voldemort could not truly die while the fragment within Harry continued to exist, when he understood that his own death might be necessary to defeat the Dark Lord permanently, he faced this knowledge with the same courage his parents had shown, the same willingness to sacrifice everything for the greater good. The boy who had lived became the young man who chose to die, not from despair or defeat, but from love and hope, and the understanding that some victories can only be won through surrender. The walk into the Forbidden Forest, toward the clearing where Voldemort waited with his followers, was perhaps the longest and most difficult journey Harry had ever undertaken. Each step carried him closer to what seemed like certain death, further from the friends and the world he loved, deeper into the darkness that had shaped so much of his life. Yet he walked without hesitation, without doubt, carrying within himself not just the fragment of his enemy's soul, but all the love that had protected and sustained him through 17 years of life. The killing curse that struck him in that forest clearing was spoken with all of Voldemort's power and hatred behind it, green light blazing through the darkness like a star falling to earth. But this time, the magic that surrounded Harry was different. Not just his mother's protection, but his own willing sacrifice, his conscious choice to die for others, his deliberate acceptance of death as the price of victory over evil. The curse found its mark and sent Harry into a realm between life and death, a place that existed in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between one moment and the next. King's Cross Station appeared around him, not the real station, but something that existed in the deepest places of his mind, a representation of transition and choice, of journeys undertaken and destinations reached, and there, in that liminal space where souls go to make their final choices, Harry found not one presence, but two. Dumbledore waited for him with the gentle smile of someone who had made his own journey from life to whatever lay beyond, ready to guide and comfort, as he had always done. But huddled in the corner, pitiful and broken, was something else. The fragment of Voldemort's soul that had lived within Harry for 17 years, now separated from its unwilling host and revealed for what it truly was. The piece of soul was dying, had been dying slowly for years under the constant pressure of the love that surrounded it, weakened by every act of kindness Harry had performed, diminished by every choice he had made to help rather than harm. The killing curse had finally severed its connection to Harry completely, leaving it naked and vulnerable, unable to return to its source or find another vessel for its continued existence. Harry looked upon this fragment of his greatest enemy with something approaching pity, recognizing it not as a threat, but as something broken and lost, a piece of soul that had been torn from wholeness and could never find its way back. In that moment of recognition, the last link between them was finally, gently allowed to dissolve. The foreign presence that had shared his thoughts and dreams for so long fading away like smoke, dispersing on a summer breeze. The choice that faced Harry then was simple yet profound. He could board the train that would carry him beyond the veil of death, could join his parents and all those who had gone before him in whatever realm awaited souls that had completed their earthly journey. Or he could return to the world of the living, could take up once more the burden of existence, could continue the fight against darkness with a spirit finally free from the corruption that had marked his entire life. The decision came not from duty or obligation, not from any external pressure or expectation, but from love itself. Love for the friends who waited for him, for the world that still needed protection, for the future that remained to be built when the last fragments of Voldemort's evil were finally swept away. Harry chose life, chose to return, chose to continue carrying light into the darkness, not because he had to, but because he wanted to, because he understood at last that the greatest magic of all was the willingness to keep choosing love, even in the face of everything that sought to destroy it. His return to consciousness in the forest clearing was gentle, like waking from a deep and peaceful sleep into morning sunshine. The fragment of Voldemort's soul was gone, purged from his being by the killing curse and his own willing sacrifice, leaving behind only Harry Potter, not the boy who lived, not the chosen one, not a Horcrux or a weapon or a symbol, but simply a young man who had learned that love was stronger than death, hope more powerful than despair, and light capable of overcoming even the deepest darkness. The final battle that followed, the confrontation between Harry and Voldemort in the Great Hall of Hogwarts, was less a clash of magical powers than a meeting between two completely different philosophies of existence. On one side stood Voldemort, still broken despite his physical restoration, still fractured despite his attempts to repair the damage done by creating Horcruxes, still fundamentally unable to understand the forces that had brought about his repeated defeats. On the other side stood Harry, whole at last, free from the burden of carrying his enemy's essence, able to face the Dark Lord not as someone bound to him by shared soul fragments, but as someone who had chosen to stand against everything he represented. The magic that flowed through him was clean and bright, uncontaminated by darkness, powered not by hatred or fear, but by the love of those who fought beside him, who had died for him, who continued to believe in the possibility of a better world. When Voldemort's final killing curse met Harry's disarming spell in the center of the Great Hall, when the magic of one who had never understood love collided with the power of one who had been shaped by it from his earliest moments, the outcome was inevitable. The Dark Lord's curse rebounded once again, but this time there were no Horcruxes to prevent his death, no fragments of soul scattered through the world to ensure his survival. He fell as mortals fall, completely and finally, his body crumpling to the floor while his spirit, damaged beyond repair by years of splitting and corruption, passed beyond the veil to whatever judgment awaited souls that had chosen evil over good. Harry stood in the sudden silence that followed, wand still in his hand, but no longer needed, surrounded by friends and allies who had fought beside him through the darkest hours. The scar on his forehead which had burned with pain for so many years whenever Voldemort drew near, was quiet at last, no longer a window into an enemy's thoughts, but simply a mark of what had been endured and overcome. In the days and weeks that followed, as the wizarding world began to heal from the wounds of war, as families reunited and communities rebuilt, as the work of creating a better future began in earnest, Harry found himself changed in ways both subtle and profound. The absence of the soul fragment that had lived within him for so long was not felt as emptiness, but as freedom. Freedom to be completely himself, to feel his own emotions without the interference of another's darkness, to make choices based purely on his own values and desires. The magic that surrounded him seemed different too, cleaner and more responsive, as if some barrier that had always existed between him and the full expression of his abilities had been removed. But more than any change in his magical capabilities was the sense of peace that had settled over his spirit, the quiet contentment that came from knowing he had carried a piece of ultimate evil within himself and had never allowed it to corrupt his essential nature. Years later, as he walked through a world transformed by the victory over Voldemort, as he saw children playing in streets that no longer knew fear, as he watched friends marry and have children of their own, Harry would sometimes touch the scar that marked his forehead and remember the fragment of soul that had once resided there, not with anger or resentment, but with something approaching gratitude for the experiences it had given him, for the insights into darkness that had made him appreciate light, for the constant reminder that the battle between good and evil is fought not just in the external world, but in the depths of every human heart. The boy who had lived had become the man who chose to keep living, to keep loving, to keep fighting for a world where children could grow up without carrying pieces of their enemies' souls, where love was stronger than hate, where light could overcome any darkness that sought to extinguish it. His scar remained as a reminder not of what he had endured, but of what could be overcome, not of the darkness he had carried, but of the light he had chosen to be. And in the quiet moments of evening, when peace settled over the world like a gentle benediction, when the last fragments of Voldemort's legacy had finally been swept away by time and love, and the simple human refusal to let evil have the final word, Harry Potter would close his eyes and feel the wholeness of his own soul, no longer divided, no longer burdened, finally and completely free to be exactly what he had always been meant to be. A beacon of light in a world that would always need such illumination, a reminder that even the darkest magic could be overcome by the simple, powerful, eternal magic of love, freely given and gratefully received. Dear listener, as this final chapter of our gentle journey draws to its close, let yourself rest in the profound knowledge that wholeness can be restored, that even the deepest wounds can heal, and that love truly is the most powerful magic in any world. The boy who carried darkness within himself, yet chose to radiate light, has found his peace at last, his soul finally free from the burden that marked his entire life, his spirit whole and unbroken and ready to embrace whatever adventures await. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let your mind drift toward the quiet spaces where peace lives and love grows. And know that, like Harry, finding freedom from the darkness he carried, like the fragment of evil being gently released into the light of understanding and forgiveness, you too can let go of whatever burdens have marked your journey through this day, allowing them to dissolve into the gentle rest that comes to those who understand that we are more than the sum of our wounds, greater than our deepest fears, and capable of choosing light even when darkness seems overwhelming. Sleep now and let the fragments find their wholeness. Let the burdens transform into blessings, and dream of a world where love conquers all, where light overcomes every shadow, and where every soul, no matter how divided, can find its way back to the perfect, peaceful, eternal unity from which all healing flows and to which all weary spirits eventually, inevitably, gratefully return.